Yo, what's good people? Today we have another review. Today we have the Punk Workshop Blaze buttons, as you can see. So these are very interesting because they actually feature mouse switches. They have barely any travel, as you can see, but they're very strange because they use mouse switches. So this switch is very different and it's kind of the craze right now. It's between these Punk Workshop Blaze and the flash taps, but the guy who makes the flash taps does not ship internationally, unfortunately, so I can't get the flash taps to actually compare, but I will be doing a comparison between the Blaze and your Game of Fingers, your Nth KRM, and your Overdrive Pulse, which is kind of my top three right now. So I'll be doing a very in-depth breakdown, teardown, and comparison of this button between my top three. And we're going to kind of see why people are kind of losing their minds over these mouse switch buttons. Personally, for me, I'm just going to say it off the bat, these are very weird. They kind of almost feel like they have a learning curve attached to them, which is weird because usually when I'm trying a new button, I can adjust within 2 minutes or so. But these really feel like I have to kind of relearn my techniques and rhythm. So usually when I'm reviewing buttons, I will put them in the controller that I'm using right now, but I don't want to remove the buttons from my current controller. So usually what I do is I actually have a test bench hitbox, as you can see with the Blaze. Now again, just off the bat, these are very satisfying but weird to press. So you see how it's kind of like a mouse switch. They're very interesting buttons, actually. They're really interesting. I feel like, personally for me, of first impressions, I feel like they're going to be very good for 2D games. But for 3D, they're really strange. I don't know what it is. It feels like if you're a heavy-handed player, I think it's going to take some getting used to this button because it has a 60-gram actuation force actually in this button. And so that's actually heavier than what you would find on a typical, Speed Silver, which is usually around 40 grams actuation force. And because they have such little travel, as you can see here, I'm going to show you again. You see how little travel they have? Even though the switch itself is not super sensitive inside, it's just because, you have super low travel. I tend to rest my fingers on my buttons when I'm playing levelers. So for me, they feel super sensitive, but not sensitive to the point where you get misinputs. They won't actuate. I've not ran into that issue just yet. So I think the actuation force is fine. It's just they do feel a little bit sensitive just because the travel distance, again, is super short. As you can see, just something to keep in mind is that I feel like the learning curve is quite steep with these buttons, which seems weird to say because, I'm pretty comfortable on levelers just because I've been playing on it for a while. But even switching to these buttons, I kind of felt like, it was very alien to me. Such a lack of travel is weird to get used to. Okay, here we have the Punk Workshop Blaze. And as you can see, the buttons are super low profile. There's zero travel. Right out of the gate, I will say that the buttons feel like a very big learning curve, which is crazy because usually if I'm using a new button, I can take 5 minutes adaptation and start using the button as normal. It does feel very responsive. Now that is one thing that I will give them, is that they do feel super responsive. And obviously because they have such little travel, any movement, any sort of force actuates the button, which can be a good thing or bad thing depending on who you are and how you play. Now let's talk about them in an actual case. Now, to be honest, I think Punk Workshop QC isn't very good, and I'll tell you the reasons why. These tabs here on the side, so these tabs snap in, are really wide. So the button is actually super wide and it was really difficult for me to get them into the hitbox case, which usually is no issue. The tolerances are not very strict in the hitbox. So for these to give me so many problems when trying to put them in the case is an issue. Now, the second problem I had was on this jump button here, these sides were much more difficult to actuate than the other sides, which is an issue for me because depending on what I'm doing, I will use my right thumb and I'm kind of pressing it here, or I'll use my left thumb and I'm pressing it in a different spot, as you can see. So having variance in the actuation force on either side is not a good thing. And I think the consistency for me straight away was weird. So I had to kind of dissect the button and take them apart. Now, here's the other issue. You need Allen keys to take these apart, and you need a very small Allen key. So this one is 1.5 millimeter, as you can see. So you need a 1.5 millimeter Allen key like this. It's super tiny, as you can see here. So this is the type of Allen key that you would need to take apart the buttons. If you do have any issues, you might not, but for me, I did actually have issues with the jump button and the switch inside it. So I had to take it apart with an Allen key. So quickly before I take apart the button, I've already taken one apart so we can actually see how the buttons are constructed. So we have the housing, which is just regular housing. We have the mouse switch. So you will see some more detailed B-roll of the switches, but these are switches from Omron, as you can see. Now we have like an actuation module. I don't know the specific term for it, but this is kind of what the cap sits on top of. So you put the cap on top of this, like so. So it sits on the top, and then this is what you press to actuate the switch beneath it. And as I was saying about the screws before, super small Allen keys required. As you can see, the screw is tiny. Just gonna try and make it hit the light so you can actually see how tiny that screw is. So yeah, you'll need a 1.5mm Allen key to open these buttons up. Okay, so let's talk about deconstruction. So as you can see, this is a fully assembled blaze button. So all we need to do is make sure that we do actually have an Allen key that's small enough to take the screws out. Now these are really fiddly as well to take apart, very, very fiddly, especially because the tools required are so small. So I'm going to unscrew these two. I'm going to jump to when I've unscrewed both of them or loosened them enough to show you taking them out. Okay, so I've loosened the screws, as you can see, and the screws basically clamp the switch to the body. So this is the bottom of the switch. This is the switch board at the bottom. And so the screws kind of fasten the switch to the housing, and the actuation module inside, as you can see, the white piece that sits on top, and then the cap sits on top of the actuation module. And this is the second screw that I'm taking out. So now we're just left with the switch. You just take the switch off. As you can see, the button just kind of comes apart very easily. So this is the switch, fastened to the switch board. And then we have kind of the actuation module on top and the cap on top of that. You are going to have to know how to take these buttons apart and have the tools required to do so if you do have problems with these buttons. And as I said, I don't think the QC is very good. Now, to be honest, I did also have issues with Punk Workshop's V2 buttons as well. And the issue I had with them was with the connection pins. So the connection pins were very unstable and they disconnected very frequently, which was very annoying because you don't want to get to a point where you order as many as you need. Let's say, for example, you order 12, 11, 24mm and one 30mm. So you don't want to get to a point where you order just what you need and one has QC problems or two have QC problems, because then you're going to have to go and buy more and wait for shipping. So I would advise to purchase maybe 2 or 3 spares of each size. So 2 or 3 extra 24mm and 2 or 3 extra 30mm, just to kind of mitigate the risk of being subject to QC issues, because it is very annoying. And to be honest, unless you have the tools like this Allen key, you're going to find it very hard to fix any problems yourself. However, QC issues aside, I do think that these buttons feel quite responsive because they're so low profile, they feel really responsive. And of course they're satisfying to press because they're mouse switches. So they feel very addictive to press like this. But again, I do think the learning curve is quite steep with these buttons, which sounds insane to say for a button, but it's true. Because they're mouse switches as well and they kind of actuate differently and they return differently, it's weird. They just feel weird, but they do feel very satisfying to press. And also, I feel like for micro movement and micro defense, like for example, in Tekken, we have things called fuzzy guarding. So for fuzzy guarding, I feel like these buttons are really good for fuzzy guards, or for like micro sidestepping, dash blocking. They feel very responsive. But for other things, I feel like they feel really weird. So like, for example, if I'm doing Raven's wave dash like this, it can feel a little bit weird. And the other version that I do is with SOCD is that I hold down and I piano forward and up. Now this motion feels very weird and inconsistent for me on the Punk Workshop Blaze. Now that's why I'm saying I think the learning curve is quite steep with these buttons. Coming to throw breaking, the 1+2 inputs or double button inputs are very, very consistent because there's no travel. So I feel like because there's less travel, it kind of relaxes the leniency a little bit, because there's less room for error in terms of like there's less room for a 2-1 input or there's less room for a 1-2. It's usually just a 1+2 and it's very easy. Okay, so here we are on Punk Workshop's website. If you come to the website, you can see more information about the Blaze if you come to shop and then blaze, and then it will tell you a little bit more. So this is the switch that's in the button. Now this switch does have 60 grams of actuation force. The most notable stat here is really the travel, because it has pretty much no travel, which is kind of the whole selling point of the button, is that they have no travel and they use mouse switches. So they feel very responsive, I would say. There's not really that much information on the buttons. It doesn't actually tell you the actuation force of the button. Now, if you just look up this switch model number, you will see that the actuation force is 60 grams. As previously said before, I think don't be fooled with the 60 grams, because in reality, I personally feel like these Punk Workshop Blaze, they feel slightly more sensitive than your typical mechanical arcade button with a speed silver that has usually 40 grams of actuation force. Now, to be honest, I feel like these switches and the switch being in the housing and with the cap on, they feel slightly more sensitive just because it has less travel. As you can see here, if you scroll down to key features, it has a total travel distance of 0.5 millimeters, which is basically nothing. So that's why they look so flat in terms of the resistivity of the buttons. It's basically nothing. It honestly feels like you're pressing paper, which is crazy. So again, this is the whole selling point of the button. And now we're going to go into game, test some execution, test some movement, test throw breaking as well, which I think is a huge part. Double button inputs is a huge kind of area that you're going to have to deal with, especially if you're transitioning from pad, where you can use binds. Of course, you can use binds for levelers and stick. However, I just think it's a little bit unnatural. Perhaps if you're a new player to levelers, you can actually train your muscle memory to use binds and transfer the muscle memory from pad to levelers. However, for me, I primarily played on pad, but I did have stick experience. And obviously when I played stick, I would double button input my throw breaks, right? So that kind of transferred for me over to levelers. So it's way more difficult for me to just drop my muscle memory and use binds. So that's why when I'm testing new buttons, I'm like, okay, how good is this button actually for double button inputs? Because if I can't break 1+2 throws consistently because of the button, now you might say yes, technique and all this stuff, but for me personally, there's buttons that I just can throw break consistently on. I'm pressing 1+2. My fingers are pressing 1+2 and I'm getting 1+2 or 1+2. And that's because Tekken doesn't have as much leniency with the throw break buffering system as other games. It punishes you for pressing 2 slightly more early than 1 and so on and so forth. So again, this is a huge area I look for and test in buttons is double button inputs. And this passes the test with flying colors, to be honest. This is one of the most consistent buttons for me personally that I've tried regarding double button inputs. Very, very clean. Okay, let's get into some inputs. Now, again, movement feels very good, but for very complex inputs like snake dash cancel, it can take a little bit of getting used to be honest, because it's like, because the travel distance is less, you really have to feather the inputs. I feel like feathering inputs, if you are the type of person that already feathers your inputs, I think these buttons are going to be right up your alley, to be honest, because I feel like these buttons actually punish harsh inputs. It will really expose you if your inputs are not clean, if that makes sense. And to be honest, all levelers controllers will do that as well. But I just feel like with these buttons, there's no room for error. Like movement feels super strict on these buttons. Even with like S or CD, it's like if I don't perfectly input something, I'm going to get a stutter in the backdash. Now with Bryan, I feel like these buttons are actually character specific and how good they are for different characters. Now for Bryan, I would really recommend these buttons if you do play the character, because taunt dash is insane. Like taunt dash is ridiculous. So usually when you're taunt dashing with Bryan, you will start getting misinputs if you're sloppy with the inputs. Now, you will get throw if you press taunt plus forward. As you can see, you can taunt as quickly or as slowly as you want. I really feel like these buttons are sick for Bryan. Ridiculous. These buttons are actually ridiculous for Bryan. So I really do feel like it depends on the character you play. Now, yeah, for Bryan, I really enjoy them. Especially for taunt dash, it's just so clean. Now, when you do press forward and taunt, you will get throw like this. But yeah, these buttons for Bryan. Now we're going to do taunt forward forward 2, which is very, 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 very difficult. Usually when I do execution stuff, I don't usually do taunt forward forward 2 as a execution showcase because it's very hard. Okay, so now we picked Paul because he has a sway back. And moving around with them feels very smooth. As always. But I feel like I really do have to slow down my inputs for stuff to register. I feel like I can't rush my inputs. Otherwise, you'll get like stutters in the backdash. You see, like that. So I have to kind of be very deliberate and slow with my inputs, I feel like, with Paul. So again, they do feel good. I do feel like they're slightly overhyped. I feel like because they're such a new product and it's such a new concept in terms of putting mouse switches and buttons, everyone's kind of running and flocking to this new button type. When honestly, I prefer, right now anyway, just regular mechanical arcade buttons. The thing is, because they have such little travel, often you can get, you see the input there, the down forward with no down forward. You can start getting inputs like that, and that's gonna affect your QCBs and QCFs. I really feel like I have to exaggerate what I'm doing. You see again there, I have to exaggerate my inputs, which I don't like, and I feel like I'm fighting the inputs. But if you want something different, I feel like these are a pretty good button to kind of have in your collection, because I feel like they do have potential, and once you're used to the inputs, they can be very, very good. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to set up Kazuya's down forward 1 strings, as you can see. So he's got a heat engager, which is down forward 1, 2, and he's got a tailspin version of that move, which is down forward 1, hold, down forward 2. So we're going to select this, and then we're also going to select down forward 1, 4, right? So we're going to fuzzy duck this string, and you're going to see why fuzzy ducking is important for some characters. You see why fuzzy ducking is important, because I can deal with all of those strings. You see, I can launch. Bit late on that one. And even if you don't want to do that, you can do back 1, 2. See? So I think overall for defense, these buttons feel really good because they have no travel. So it's like whatever I'm pressing is going to be instant. So for blocking lows, for fuzzying strings, for micro movement feels very good. But for everything else, I feel like I actually am fighting the button for the input. So for QCFs, they feel very tight. And I feel like I have to really exaggerate the input to get QCFs or QCBs, which I don't like. But for everything defense, I feel like it's very good. Movement just feels box standard, levelless movement. It is nothing special. I mean, for dash blocking, it feels pretty good. Yeah, for defense, I think the strongest elements of these buttons is actually for defense. And I feel like the weakest element of this button is consistency, because of the QC is very bad from Punk Workshop. As of late, I've had problems with their V2 regular button, and I've had problems with the Blaze as well. I had problems with the jump button where it would feel uneven in the actuation, and I had to go and unscrew the button and fix it myself, which isn't exactly user friendly. If the QC is pretty bad, it's not exactly user friendly. So I would recommend to pick them up to kind of try them out. I would place them probably on the level of like crowns, I would say, but I think they definitely do have more potential to explore than crowns, or for the majority of mechanical arcade buttons. Just because of how they're designed, they do actually have a lot of potential. I just feel like people are talking about buttons that have mouse switches as the new best thing. And personally, I really do think it depends on character as well. But overall, I think they are overhyped, but they are good. Let me know what you think about these buttons in the comments below, because I'm quite intrigued to know like what you guys think of these Punk Workshop Blaze buttons, if you've tried them or if you're looking to pick them up, and what you think about the kind of new technology behind buttons now having mouse switches inside them. What do you guys think? I personally feel like they're slightly overrated, but that's just me. But anyway, that was it for this Punk Workshop Blaze review. Hope you enjoyed. Peace.